Napoleon's interest in a specific adventure in Egypt, as opposed to his general mania for the Orient, can be traced back to 1797. In July of that year, Talleyrand, newly arrived from the USA, and soon to be the Directory's foreign minister, lectured to the Institute of Sciences and Arts in Paris on the advantages of acquiring new colonies. Talleyrand argued that Egypt was an ideal colony, as it was closer to France than her possessions in Haiti and the West Indies and not so vulnerable, either to the Royal Navy or the rising power of the USA. He pointed out that the great 18th century French statesman the Duc de Choiseul had wanted to buy Egypt from Turkey. The idea had been in the air from other sources too, from Magellan, the one-time French consul in Cairo who stressed that this was the obvious gateway to India, and from Volney's considerations sur la guerre actuelle des Turcs. It was perhaps no coincidence that Talleyrand was appointed foreign minister 15 days after making this speech. Whether prompted by Talleyrand or not, on our 6 August 1, 797 Napoleon wrote from Mamelo to the directors as follows: "The time is not far distant when we shall feel that, in order to destroy England once and for all we must occupy Egypt. The approaching death of the vast Ottoman Empire forces us to think ahead about our trade in the Levant." Soon he and Talleyrand were deeply involved in the project, at least at a theoretical level. On the 13th of September, Napoleon wrote to the foreign minister to suggest that as a prelude to the conquest of Egypt, France should invade Malta. The island had a population of who were disgusted with their hereditary rulers, the Knights of St. John, while the knights were a shadow of their former military selves and could easily be suborned from the Grand Master. Through his secret agents on the island, Napoleon had already learned that the order was in a terminal state of decline. When the French Revolution swept away feudal dues and benefices and confiscated church property, it unwittingly signed a death sentence on the knights. Besides, most of them were French, and would they really oppose an army from the French mainland when the only possible beneficiaries were the English? After the debacle in the Directory on the 24th of February, Napoleon went away to compose a memorandum, stressing the advantages of an Egyptian expedition and setting out the minimum requirements in men and material. The directors balked at the size of expedition Napoleon proposed, especially as it would divert military resources from the European front, but they desperately wanted to be rid of Bonaparte, so agreed to the enterprise on the 5th of March. The much-touted idea that the directors opposed the adventure vehemently is false. Secret preparations were at once put in hand. Napoleon meanwhile ostentatiously attended the Institute daily, as if he were intending to withdraw into private life. As a further blind, he was renamed commander of the descent on England with much public trumpeting. Napoleon's motives for going to Egypt were a curious mixture of the rational and the irrational, in which expediency and cold calculation went hand in hand with his Oriental complex. Some of the ideas in his memorandum were highly attractive to the Directory, though it is not clear how practicable they were. The most tantalizing notion was that of establishing a French colony without slaves to take the place of Santo Domingo and the sugar islands of the West Indies, which would provide France with the primary products of Africa, Syria and Arabia, while also providing a huge market for French manufactures. In the short term, there were cogent military arguments, even if based on rather too many imponderables. If the conquest of Egypt was wholly successful, it could be used as a springboard for reinforcing Tipu Sahib, Sultan of Mysore, and the Marathas, and ultimately expelling the British from India. Links with Tipu had been all but severed when the British captured the Cape of Good Hope. If a Suez Canal could be dug, this would destroy the efficacy of the route round the Cape and neutralize British sea power. An immediate consequence of the conquest of Egypt might be that France could use the country as a bargaining counter against Turkey. Certainly the threat to India would pressurize Pitt towards peace. Above all, the invasion of Egypt would be easier to achieve and less expensive than a descent on England. These points could be argued for and against and were well within the realm of the feasible. But some of Napoleon's utterances suggest an unassimilated obsession with the Orient, where the motives cannot be integrated into a rational framework. His reading of Plutarch, Marigny and Abramelin had augmented his desire to emulate Alexander the Great and Tamerlane. He was always interested in the Turkish Empire, and, even if we did not know of his early hankering to serve the Porte, we would be alerted to the romantic side of his perception of the Orient by his many asides to Burian. "We must go to the Orient, all great glory has been acquired there." On the 29th of January 1798, 2 days after protracted talks with Talleyrand about all the implications of an Egyptian adventure, he remarked to Burian, "I don't want to stay here, there's nothing to do, everything's finished here, but I haven't had enough glory. This tiny Europe doesn't provide enough, so I must go east." In the early months of 1798, Napoleon's Oriental complex chimed perfectly with his own objective self-interest. After 3 months in Paris, he was ceasing to be an object of universal fascination. Convinced of the need for ceaseless momentum, He knew he had either to attempt a coup in Paris or to find an adventure elsewhere. He felt he would probably lose if he attempted an invasion of England, but would probably win if he went to Egypt. True, there was great risk from the Royal Navy, but, after the loss of Leghorn and Hoch's invasion attempts in 1796, the British had pulled their fleets out of the Mediterranean. If cross-channel invasion fever could be kept up, it was likely they would stay out. For 2 months from the 5th of March, Napoleon moved heaven and earth to put together a viable expedition. He had to raise the money, troops and ships needed while maintaining secrecy about the destination of his forces. He had to find a means of selling the idea of Egypt to the French population at large when the secret became known. And he had to be absolutely sure in his own mind that he was doing the right thing, that his absence would not, after all, play into the hands of his enemies and political rivals. France was not yet psychologically ready for the fall of the Directory, and the five must be given enough rope to hang themselves with. On the other hand, if things went wrong in Egypt or he was away too long, Napoleon could come back to find that he was yesterday's man and that Bernadotte, a new Hoch or maybe even Barras, still was the man of the hour. Napoleon's actions throughout March-May 1798 were those of a gambler playing for very high stakes, and it is this that accounts for the many blips in the preparation of the expedition. The first problem was that of men, money and material. Napoleon had originally projected a total army of 6,000 for his ultimate advance into India. These were to comprise 30,000 Frenchmen and 30,000 recruits he hoped to find in Egypt, conveyed on horses and camels, together with provisions for 60 days and water for 6. With these, a train of artillery, RSO field pieces and a double issue of ammunition, he estimated he could reach the Indus in 4 months. The very mention of the Indus, with its association with Alexander the Great, is suggestive. However, Napoleon was prevailed on by Talleyrand to do separate estimates for Egypt alone, so as not to alarm the directors. He therefore asked for 25,000 men and the use of the Toulon fleet already in being, making the costings far less than for the descent on England, and the directors granted him this without demur. Next he assembled a galaxy of military talent. The 30-year-old Louis-Charles de Saix was a military hero Napoleon had met in Rastatt the previous November. De Saix was an ex-aristocrat who as a young man had refused to become an emigre. Ugly, with a saber scar across his face, he was still an avid womanizer. He had won his laurels in Moreau's Black Forest campaign in 1796 and the following year held the fortress of Calais for 2 months against the Austrians, where a lesser man would have capitulated after a week. He and Napoleon had a rare rapport, and perhaps not coincidentally he was the greatest military talent ever to fight at Bonaparte's side. The 45-year-old Jean-Baptiste Kleber, on the other hand, never liked Napoleon but was invaluable in the field. His pedigree included the Vendée War and victories at Fleurus and Altenkirchen in 1794–96. Additionally, Napoleon had as his chief of cavalry General Dumas, future father of the novelist, and the one-legged General Louis Caffarelli as chief of engineers. The reliable Louis Berthier acted as chief of staff and Androche Junot as principal aide-de-camp. Most of the other generals were new men: de Hilliers, Menou, Bonne, Rainier. Napoleon was lucky in being able to take so much military talent with him at a time when warfare threatened France on other fronts, but the Directory played into his hands by turning down his offer to give up de Saix and Kleber so that they could concentrate on descents on the British Isles. Money was a particular problem, for Talleyrand and Napoleon had sold the idea of Egypt to the directors on the ground that it would pay for itself. This meant that Napoleon would have to raise 9 million francs before the expedition could sail. He demanded from the directors permission for hand-picked men to go abroad to extract this sum and accordingly sent Joubert, Berthier and Brune to, respectively, Holland, Rome and Switzerland to obtain the funds. These plundering expeditions were the most barefaced Napoleon had yet authorized. Brune's ruthless campaign in Switzerland, where he uplifted 14 million francs, achieved notoriety, and Brune himself became a byword for plundering. When the Directory appointed him to Italy, he had the audacity to levy a further 2,000 francs for the expenses of his previous looting. On the journey south, the bottom of his carriage collapsed under the weight of stolen gold he had stashed in its boot. In Italy, Brune continued his career as a kind of licensed pirate, and went from strength to strength until his disgrace in 807. Having by the most brutal methods raised the funds for his expedition, Napoleon faced the next problem, that of persuading the French people that their hero had embarked on a worthwhile, prestigious and glorious venture. His ploy was to surround the expedition with the aura of scientific discovery. Without telling his chosen candidates exactly where they were going, Napoleon invited scores of eminent scientists to accompany him on a tropical voyage of adventure. Given that they were taking a leap into the unknown, it is surprising how few of the savants turned him down. It was doubtless his role and status at the Institute that persuaded them. If the British had intercepted and sunk Napoleon's Egyptian flotilla, much of France's intellectual talent would have gone to the bottom. Among the celebrities who accepted his invitation were Gaspard Monge, the highly talented mathematician, physicist and inventor of descriptive geometry, Jean-Baptiste Fourier, the equally brilliant mathematician, Claude-Louis Berthollet, the great pioneering chemist, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, the naturalist, Nicolas Comte, the inventor and ballooning expert, Gretet de Dolomieu, the mineralogist for whom the Dolomite Mountains are named, Matthew de Lesseps, father of Ferdinand, whose journey to Egypt sowed the idea of a Suez Canal which he passed on to his son, Vivant Denon the engraver, and a host of others, including astronomers, civil engineers, geographers, draftsmen, printers, gunpowder experts, poets, painters, musicians, archaeologists, orientalists and linguists. In all, over so distinguished members of the Institute answered Bonaparte's call. It was a brilliant stroke of propaganda genius to include these ideologues, as it enabled Napoleon to obfuscate the true motives for the Egyptian expedition. His claim to be engaged on a civilizing mission has fooled many people, and the myth persists even today. To seek out new worlds in order to enhance pure knowledge and to bring the light of Western civilization to benighted regions of the globe provided superb ideological rationalization for an enterprise that was always part hard-headed Machiavellian calculation and part romantic fantasy. The two sides of Napoleon, ruthless, cynical, down-to-earth pragmatist on the one hand, and dreamer and fantasist on the other, were rarely so perfectly dovetailed. The ideological camouflage provided in addition by the scientists and intellectuals who accompanied him makes the Egyptian venture something of a motivational masterpiece. Finally, Napoleon had to keep his destination secret. This he did with remarkable success, aided by the undoubted fact that troops continued to collect in Channel ports. They would eventually be used in the ill-fated Hardy Humbert expedition to Ireland in August. Only the English agent at Leghorn correctly guessed the true destination of Napoleon's men, but his view was dismissed skeptically at the Admiralty. Another factor helping Napoleon was that at the very time he set out for Egypt, a great rebellion broke out in Ireland, which occupied a good deal of English attention. The one serious miscalculation, it was nearly fatal, that Napoleon made was to assume that the Royal Navy would not re-enter the Mediterranean. Some instinct, or was it merely the Jeremiah laments of his right-hand man Henry Dundas, led the warmongering and ferocious Francophobe William Pitt to send a strong naval squadron under Nelson into the Mediterranean, when the obvious course would have been simply to bottle up the exit from the Straits of Gibraltar. Ironically, it was land-based events in Europe rather than the Royal Navy which nearly torpedoed the Egyptian expedition. Napoleon's Machiavellian suggestion that Bernadotte be appointed envoy to Vienna had succeeded in discrediting the vainglorious Gascon, just as Bonaparte had hoped, but the boomerang effects threatened to unhorse him as well. On the 22nd of April, Napoleon wrote to Admiral Brueys, commanding the Toulon fleet that was to cover the expedition on its perilous track to Egypt, that he would be leaving for Toulon tomorrow. Suddenly urgent word came from the Directory that Napoleon was required to return to Rastatt, there to demand satisfaction from the Austrian Emperor for the Bernadotte affair. Once ensconced in Vienna as ambassador, the ultra-Jacobin Bernadotte ran up the tricolour on the masthead of his hotel. This was construed as an insult by the Viennese, who flouted diplomatic immunity, invaded the house, tore down the flag and plied Bernadotte with insults. The director's instinctive reaction was to declare war, but Napoleon advised them strongly that they should not reopen hostilities because of the folly of Bernadotte. He declared himself satisfied that the Austrians would give satisfaction for the incident, and, besides, French forces were now too dispersed, in Rome, Switzerland, Holland, the Channel ports, to make a campaign against Austria feasible. The response of the directors was that Napoleon should go to Rastatt with all speed. Napoleon told them forthrightly that his involvement with Campo Formio and Rastatt had ended the year before and he would not be gommed. Here was yet another standoff, and for the first time since his return to Paris Napoleon began seriously to consider seizing power as the only way to rid himself of the troublesome directors. On the very day he wrote to Brueys, and just before the courier from the Directory arrived, he had told Bourrienne, who asked him how long he would be in Egypt, a few months or a few years, depending. They don't want me here. To make things right, I suppose I should overthrow them and make myself king, but it's not time to think of that yet. Doubtless Barras intuited something of what was on Bonaparte's mind, for on the 27th of April, 4 days after the lengthy and acrimonious session in the Directory, he informed the general that the Directory had decided not to send him to Rastatt, and he was therefore free to leave for Toulon. Even so, friends like Arnault urged Napoleon right up to the last moment to stay and seize power. Napoleon declined. The day before he left Paris he told Arnault, "The Parisians complain but they would not take action. If I mounted my horse, nobody would follow me. We'll leave tomorrow." Leaving Paris on the 4th of May, Napoleon sped southwards to Lyons via Chalon, then took a boat down the Rhône and arrived in Aix-en-Provence on the 8th. The next day he was in Toulon, conferring with Brueys, proudly overseeing the armada that had been collected there. The formal orders from the directors, originally issued on 2 April, had been reconfirmed. These instructed Bonaparte to seize Malta and Egypt, dislodge the British from the Middle East, construct a Suez Canal and build good relations with Turkey by remitting the annual tribute from Egypt to Constantinople. At this day Egypt was a Turkish possession in name only, having for centuries been in the grip of a ruling military elite, the Mamelukes, who did not recognize the sovereignty of the Porte. The directors had agreed on a twin-track strategy towards Turkey whereby, while Napoleon was conquering Egypt, Talleyrand would head a mission to Constantinople to explain that the expedition, far from being aimed at Turkey, actually served their interests. After 10 weeks of frenzied preparations, 21 brigades had been detached from armies in Italy, Rome, Corsica, Switzerland and northern France, although most of the units were veterans of the Army of Italy. By legerdemain, Napoleon had greatly exceeded the numbers agreed with the Directory. Instead of 25,000 there were actually 38,000 troops, ready to embark in 400 transports from 5 ports: Toulon, Marseille, Genoa, Ajaccio, Civitavecchia. There were 60 field guns, 40 siege guns, hard rations for 100 days and water for 40, only 200 horses were taken along as Napoleon expected mainly to use camels as transport. The convoy was escorted by Bruys and 13 ships of the line, including the flagship L'Orient. To maintain secrecy it was agreed with Bruys that all shipping of whatever kind should be forbidden to leave Marseille and Toulon for 5 days after the Armada left. Josephine accompanied her husband as far as Toulon and, to all appearances, was determined to travel with him all the way to Egypt. That she did not has sometimes been attributed to her cunning and Machiavellianism, but the sequence of events strongly suggests that she ended up staying behind by pure accident. Napoleon was fearful that he might encounter Nelson and the Royal Navy, so arranged with Josephine that, once he passed the coast of Sicily safely, he would send back a courier to have her embark on a fast ship. Only 4 days out, he missed her so badly that he sent back the frigate Pomone to pick her up at Naples, as agreed. The fact that Josephine had meanwhile departed north for a spa at Plombières in Lorraine has made some biographers suspicious that she never intended to go to Egypt. But the more likely explanation is simply that Josephine was bird-brained when it came to business appointments, punctuality or logistics and had not allowed herself enough time to get down to Naples. Whatever the explanation, on the 20th of June she and 2 female companions were seriously injured when a wooden balcony collapsed under them while they stood gazing out at the street from the first floor. Josephine was at first thought to be partially paralyzed and to have sustained severe internal injuries. She recovered only after a long convalescence in Lorraine. Meanwhile, after being delayed for 2 weeks by contrary winds, the Egyptian armada finally stood away from Toulon on the 19th of May. All unawares, the French fleet was actually in the gravest danger from the Royal Navy, whose intelligence was first-rate despite all the French disinformation. While Pitt ordered Nelson to re-enter the Mediterranean, Admiral St. Vincent detached 3 frigates from the Cadiz fleet to help Nelson watch Toulon. Nelson was actually off Toulon on I-7 May while the French fleet was becalmed, but its departure 2 days later took him by surprise. The French were able to run before the wind past the east coast of Corsica, but when Nelson set off and pursued on a more westerly track he ran straight into the teeth of the gale, took severe damage and had to put into Sardinia for repairs. The amazingly fortunate French fleet in the meantime made rendezvous with the Genoa squadron on the 21st of May, and the flotilla from Ajaccio 2 days later. The Civitavecchia ships were not encountered until the 9th of June at Malta. For the first part of the voyage feelings ran high between the scientists and intellectuals on the one hand and the soldiers and sailors on the other, who treated them with amused contempt. The fault was Napoleon's for, with a foot in both camps, he could not see any reasons for disharmony, and was impatient with complaints from either side. Intending as he did to found an Egyptian institute, he turned the deck of his ship into a kind of floating university, where daily seminars were held on a wide variety of topics. It was now that Andrach Junot, Napoleon's chief aide, first revealed the qualities that would eventually lead to his fall from his master's favor. 2 years younger than Napoleon, the 27-year-old Junot was already showing signs of a world-weary cynicism, verging on nihilism, that was more appropriate to a much younger man. He had not always been thus. When his father asked skeptically after the siege of Toulon in 1793, "Who is this unknown General Bonaparte?" Junot had replied, "He is the sort of man of whom nature is sparing and who only appears on earth at intervals of centuries." Junot never entirely lost his hero worship of Napoleon, but, almost as compensation, he was devastatingly sardonic and philistine about virtually everyone and everything else. During one of the first shipboard seminars, which Napoleon expected his officers to attend, he was discovered asleep and snoring loudly. When aroused he was unrepentant. "General, it is all the fault of your confounded institute, it sends everyone to sleep, yourself included. always ready to poke fun at the academicians on L'Orient and with a pronounced taste for levity, he once made a pun on Lanz's name, pronouncing it as L'Orient. "General," he said, "why hasn't Lanz been made a member of the Institute? Surely he ought to be included on his name alone." Junot was now beginning to irritate Napoleon. After all, the scene with Josephine in March was really his fault, for Josephine dismissed her personal maid Louise Compoint for sleeping with the philandering Junot. It was in revenge for this that Compoint came to Napoleon and spilled the beans about Hippolyte Charles, the Baden Company and Josephine's infidelities. On the 9th of June the French fleet reached Malta. On paper this should have been a formidable obstacle, as the city of Valletta had walls 10 feet thick and was defended by 1,500 guns and 300 knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. But a combination of demoralization and the corrupting gold of Napoleon's secret agents had done its job well. The 200 knights of French origin resented the fact that the French Grand Master de Rohan had been succeeded by the Prussian Hompesch, and let it be known they would not oppose their compatriots. Hompesch, a defeatist, seeing the scale of external and internal opposition ranged against him, surrendered after token resistance of a day. This was the same Order of St. John that had held Malta against the cream of the Ottoman army for a whole year in the 16th century. For just 3 attackers dead the French secured a great naval base and a vast treasure. In 5 days Napoleon swept through the island like a whirlwind. He abolished the Order of St. John, deported the master and his knights, abolished slavery and feudal privileges, reformed education and the monasteries, and ordained equal rights with Christians for Jews and Moslems. Most significantly, he seized the assets of the order and those of many of the monasteries. When he sailed on, leaving behind General Vaubois and a garrison of 3,000, he took with him 7 million francs of official exactions and countless millions more as loot. Meanwhile Nelson's search for his elusive prey continued. Reinforced on the 7th of June so that he had 13 ships of the line, he wrote to the Admiralty on the ISDH to say that the French destination must be Alexandria if they went beyond Sicily. 3 days later he heard that the enemy was heading for Malta. Even as he prepared to catch them unawares at Valletta, he learned on the 21st of June that Napoleon had sailed on the 16th, figuring that since the French had a 6-day lead, he should be able to catch them at anchor off Alexandria. He made for that port with all speed, but the French had taken a different tack, to Crete and then south to Alexandria. On the night of 22 the 23rd of June the two fleets actually passed each other in the dark. 5 days later Nelson arrived at Alexandria, but, finding no sign of the French, went north to search for them along the Turkish coast, leaving behind the Captain Hardy who would feature in his dying words at Trafalgar 7 years later. Hardy, chafing impatiently off Alexandria, finally quit station just 2 days before the arrival of Napoleon's vanguard. The latter stages of the French fleet's voyage to Alexandria were marked by high seas and food shortages, with some units reduced to eating biscuit and drinking brackish water. Additionally, there was a continuing atmosphere of tension from fear of encountering Nelson and the Royal Navy, so at night all lamps were doused. It is to this voyage that we owe Bonaparte's adage about novels, that they were fit only for chambermaids, an observation provoked when he found Bourrienne, Duroc and Berthier all reading romances. The fact that Berthier's choice was Werther did not assuage his leader's derision. On the 30th of June the coastline of Egypt was spotted and next day Napoleon selected the beach at Marabout, 8 miles from Alexandria, for his landfall. Disembarking troops in high surf on this sandy beach was hazardous, but far less so than a frontal attack on Alexandria. After getting S.000 men ashore, Napoleon did not wait until he had achieved full disembarkation, but pressed on to the outskirts of Alexandria. On the 2nd of July Menou seized the triangular fort outside the city while Coup, Burr and Bonn took the Pompey and Rosetta gates. From 8 a.m. to noon a fierce battle raged as the French, spurred on by thirst, gradually broke down the Arab defenses at a cost of 300 casualties. Napoleon spent the morning sitting on a pile of ancient potsherds as he watched the unfolding battle, occasionally flicking at the shards with his whip. Alexandria was not sacked, for Napoleon gave strict instructions that Islam was to be respected, and there was to be no looting. This had the effect of making his men's morale plummet still farther. Matters reached crisis point on the subsequent march. Leaving Kleber in Alexandria with a garrison, Napoleon marched south with the main army on the 7th of July, with Desaix well ahead as a proing vanguard. Desaix's men experienced a 72-hour nightmare when confronted by the desert, the filth and squalor of the villages, and the hostility of the Bedouin, encountering wells deliberately fouled by the Arabs, mirages and suffering from ophthalmia. The army was on the point of disintegration and many men went mad. En route July Desaix's vanguard reached the Nile, where his men, desperate with thirst, threw themselves into the river. Many died here through overindulgence in slaking their thirst. It became very clear that Napoleon had timed his invasion for the very worst part of the year. The refusal to take account of seasons or the weather was always to be his Achilles' heel as a military commander. Napoleon's main army of 25,000 also went through the Slough of Despond during almost a fortnight of desert marches, when water shortages and hostile Bedouin were daily features, exacerbated by dysentery, scorpions, snakes and swarms of black flies. The French commissariat had been incompetent, water flasks had been left behind, and terrible scenes were the result. When one division halted in the desert beside two wells, 30 soldiers were trampled to death in the rush for water, while others, finding the well drunk dry, turned their guns on themselves. One eyewitness wrote, "Our soldiers were dying in the sand from lack of water and food, the intense heat forced them to abandon their booty, and many others, tired of suffering, simply blew their brains out." Fran Lesser, Ois Bernoyer, chief of supplies to the army, wrote to his wife, "I have tried to find out what our government expected when it sent an army to invade the Sultan's territory without declaring war, and without any valid reason for a declaration. Use your intelligence, I was told." Bonaparte, by reason of his genius and victories won with an invincible army, was too powerful in France. He was both an embarrassment and an obstacle to those who manipulate the levers of power. I could find no other reason for this expedition. Faced with outright mutiny, Napoleon had to concentrate the four most unreliable divisions at Damanhur, where he rebuked their commanders vociferously and unfairly. What was needed was a quick victory, followed by some looting. On the 10th of July the French were the victors at a skirmish at Damanhur. On the 13th of July there was a brisk river battle at Shubrikit between the rival Nile flotillas, which the French won. On land the army formed into squares to receive a charge from the Mameluke cavalry, but the Mamelukes sheered off. With his army still teetering on the brink of outright mutiny, the hard-driving Napoleon forced it on to Worden. By the 21st of July the French were very near Cairo. At Mbebe they could see the pyramids shimmering in the heat mists 15 miles away. It was now clear that the Mameluke commanders Murad and Ibrahim Bey were preparing to stand and fight. Napoleon drew up his 25,000 men in a line of rectangular squares, then exhorted them in a pre-battle speech containing the famous lines which may yet be almost genuine. Pointing to the pyramids he said, "Soldiers, remember that from those monuments yonder 40 centuries look down upon you." The stage was set for the inaptly named Battle of the Pyramids, more properly the Battle of Gizeh. Facing the enemy with roughly equal numbers but with a huge technological superiority, Napoleon felt supremely confident. He drew up his men in a huge field of watermelons, allowing the soldiers to slake hunger and thirst on the fruit. As soon as he felt their shattered morale had recovered sufficiently, he ordered a general shift to the right so that his army would be out of range of the guns in the Mamelukes' entrenched encampment. Murad Bey, the Mameluke commander, spotted the maneuver and ordered all his cavalry out to arrest it. This was just what Napoleon had hoped for Desaix and Rainier on the right had orders in such a case to get between the enemy cavalry and its infantry. At 3:30 that afternoon the French squares took the full force of a Mameluke cavalry charge, but the enemy horse was unsupported. In the 6 deep squares, the French did not open fire until the Mamelukes were just 50 yards away. The volley, when it came, was devastating. The charge faltered, then turned into a massacre. All that valor could do was done, but the Mamelukes charged the bristling porcupines that were the French squares for a full hour, all in vain. The fire from the French infantry was so intense that the bullets set fire to the Mamelukes' flowing robes, so that wounded horsemen writhed on the ground in agony, or burnt to death just yards away from the intact squares. The repulsed cavalrymen fled back to the entrenched camp, causing confusion and chaos just when the Mameluke infantry were already being hard-pressed by Desaix and Rainier. Taking advantage of the confusion, the 2 divisions on the French left under Bonn and Menou also advanced on the camp. To make matters worse, many of the terrified and disoriented Mamelukes fled the wrong way, thus finding themselves cut off between the victorious squares of the French center and the left and right who were attacking the camp. Total panic ensued, with thousands of Egyptian infantrymen rushing into the Nile, where they were drowned. French victory was complete, but then and since triumphalists have exaggerated the achievement. It is true that in 2 hours the Mamelukes had lost 1,000 dead as against just 29 Frenchmen killed and 260 wounded, but Murad Bey escaped from the field with 2,500 horse intact, and a majority of the infantry did manage to find boats and reach the other side of the Nile. The Battle of the Pyramids then, though a great triumph, was scarcely what one historian has called it, a massacre as complete as Kitchener's victory at Omdurman a century later. The great significance of the battle was the way it transformed the morale of the French army. It was not just the victory itself that sent spirits soaring, but the realization that in Egypt there were treasures to be looted as great if not greater than those the army had plundered in Italy. The Mamelukes had gone into battle in traditional style, bedizened with jewelry and precious stones, and thousands of bloated corpses bearing these valuable trinkets were rotting in the Nile. In addition, in despair at their unexpected defeat, the Mamelukes had tried to burn 60 treasure ships in the Nile, but most of the hoard was intact. The victorious troops spent a week fishing out the dead Mamelukes and extracting their prizes. There were to be grumblings and murmurings in the army again during the harsh year in Egypt, but never again did the problem of morale reach such crisis proportions as it had during the first 3 weeks of July 1, 798. Napoleon acted quickly to occupy Cairo before the dazed Egyptians could recover from the shock of defeat. On the 24th of July he entered the city, declared that the Mameluke era had come to an end and put the administration of Cairo in the hands of a committee of 9 sheikhs or pashas, with a French commissioner as advisor. He reiterated and repromulgated all the manifestos he had published in Alexandria, in which he declared he came to Egypt as the friend of Islam, advancing as proof his campaigns against the Pope and his destruction of the Knights of St. John on Malta. Against the day when Egypt would be completely conquered, he announced that the country would be run in the same way as its capital, with each of its 14 provinces ruled by a committee of 9 Egyptians and a French advisor. He himself would be overall ruler, assisted by a senate of 89 Egyptian notables. In Cairo, Napoleon had 2 disasters to mull over, one public, the other private. The public disaster was the loss of the French fleet at Aboukir. Nelson finally got definite news of the movements of the French fleet while he was off Greece and put about for Alexandria on the 31st of July. Next day he came on Brueys's 13 ships of the line in Aboukir Bay, and came close to annihilating them. The flagship El Orient, containing the boy who stood on the burning deck, exploded around midnight and only 2 French ships survived the naval holocaust. This was Nelson's greatest victory to date, made possible because Brueys stupidly left his flank between the bay and the shallows unguarded. Nelson sent his ships into the narrow gap, thus catching the French between 2 fires. Napoleon has sometimes been held personally to blame for this disaster through the imprecision of his orders to Brueys. The French admiral claimed he had remained at anchor because he was obeying Bonaparte's orders. Napoleon was adamant that he had instructed Brueys to enter the port of Alexandria or, if he was unable to do so, to proceed to Corfu. The best evidence suggests that Napoleon did issue unclear or imprecise orders, for on his own admission it suddenly came to him at Cairo that Brueys was in great danger. He therefore sent his aide Julian north with explicit orders, but Julian was murdered by Arabs before he reached Alexandria. Yet even if Napoleon's orders appeared to constrain Brueys, this does not explain why he did not make his left impregnable by placing a battery on the Isle of Aboukir. Brueys was, after all, an admiral in the French navy, and should have been able to work out for himself that he had either to plug that gap, to anchor inside the port of Alexandria, or at least stand away for Greece. A good admiral exercises initiative and disregards orders that make no sense, just as Nelson habitually did. Only an incompetent seaman would at once have permitted himself to be out of range of his covering shore batteries, and provided a gap between the shore and his ships which Nelson's captains could enter. This may be the point to raise a general issue. Napoleon's critics make a point of leaping on any of his instructions that contains an ambiguity, and saying that it was therefore he, not his subordinates, who was at fault. Yet it is surprising how often his subordinates interpreted these orders to their own advantage, or disobeyed them when it suited their book. Far less often do we hear of a subordinate disregarding Napoleon's orders to the leader's eventual disadvantage. Brueys was just one of many in a long list of unimaginative or self-serving commanders that would include such names as Villeneuve, Bernadotte, Ney and Grouchy. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the Battle of the Nile, it was a major disaster for the French and perceived as such by Napoleon, who tried to put a brave face on circumstances and make a virtue of necessity. The French army was now marooned in Egypt, it was true, but did not all great conquerors, from Alexander to Cortes, dispense with their fleets in order thereby to win even greater glory? Yet in his heart he knew the Battle of the Nile was a grave setback, and would have dire political consequences. He was right. Turkey immediately broke off talks with France and prepared for a faux alliance with France's enemies. The Second Coalition, formed in February R 799, would contain Turkey, Naples and Portugal as well as Britain, Austria and Russia. Napoleon could slough off responsibility for naval defeat, but there was no hiding from the humiliation when his cuckolding by Hippolyte Charles passed into the public domain. 2 days before the Battle of the Nile, Junot took it into his head to divulge to his chief all that he knew, and he knew everything about Josephine's affair with Hippolyte Charles. He produced letters detailing Josephine's return from convalescence in Plombières, full of circumstantial evidence making it clear that she and Charles were lovers. This he did in the presence of Bourrienne and Berthier. Napoleon turned pale and reproached the other two for not having told him what they must have known. This scene has been consistently misrepresented, and it is alleged that Junot thereafter fell from favor, a victim of Shoot the Messenger. It is true that Junot did fall from favor as a result of this incident, but not because he told Napoleon something hitherto unknown to him. Napoleon had his spies everywhere. He had expressly been given the same information by Joseph in March, and Josephine had already confessed. What was unpardonable about Junot's action was that he made the knowledge public, that he told the story in the presence of others. This meant Napoleon could not feed his masochistic fantasies, but had to act. hence the histrionics as reported by Burian. Divorce, yes, divorce, I want a public and sensational divorce. I don't want to be the laughingstock of Paris. I shall write to Joseph and have the divorce pronounced. I love that woman so much I would give anything if only what Junot told was not true. Misrepresentation of Junot's famous gaffe extends to character interpretation of Napoleon himself, so that we are supposed to see the incident as a turning point in his life. According to this view, from being idealistic he became cynical and ambitious, and it was in Egypt that the first strains of tyranny appeared. But Napoleon was always both idealistic and cynically ambitious, so the alleged antinomy does not hold. As for tyranny, Napoleon's most resolute critics always claim this was in evidence already in Corsica in the events of Easter 1792. Nonetheless, Napoleon's response to Junot's indiscretion is puzzling. In Cairo, before the Battle of the Nile was fought and he still expected to be back in France in a couple of months, he wrote to Joseph, "The veil is torn." It is sad when one and the same heart is torn by such conflicting feelings for one person. Make arrangements for a country place to be ready for my return, either near Paris or in Burgundy. I expect to shut myself away there for the winter. I need to be alone. I am tired of grandeur. All my feelings have dried up. I no longer care about glory. At 29 I have exhausted everything. There is nothing now left for me but to become completely selfish. Joseph, who had put all the relevant facts before Napoleon in March, must have wondered why his brother should have waited until reaching Egypt before writing in this vein. He retaliated by drawing the purse strings tighter and making Josephine sweat for her prodigious advances. Josephine hit back by alleging that Joseph was siphoning off her allowance to fund his own property speculations. The day before Napoleon wrote this letter, the 17-year-old Eugene Beauharnais, torn between love of his mother and devotion to Napoleon, wrote to Josephine to warn her that her husband now knew everything about Charles. He added, with more filial piety than conviction, that he was sure all the stories were just idle rumors. Just after the Battle of the Nile, both letters were intercepted in the Mediterranean by British cruisers.